I always say, wait until you've heard it before you clap. I'm talking about the future of British nationalism, assuming, of course, that it has one. If I can start by taking liberties with the opening lines of Dickens' Tale of Two Cities, it's the best of times, it's the worst of times. It's the season of hope, it's the season of despair. And I'd ask how better we could describe the present prospects for British nationalism halfway through the second decade of the 21st century. Nationalism throughout Europe has never been more in vogue. And one could say that that's even true of Britain. Certainly in the sense that immigration is at the top of the list of priorities in a way that it hasn't been before. But secondly, because a party that is believed to be anti-immigration did rather well in the European elections. No, I'm not talking about the British Democrats. We know what we're talking about. Indeed, it's a party, apart from being believed to be opposed to immigration, I would describe it as a party of duplicity, a party of mendacity, a party of misrepresentation, the party of Nigel Farage, but more about him later. But as far as the British nationalist movement, I'm using that in the widest sense of various nationalist parties, I can't remember it being more fragmented, so reduced to a shadow of its former self, and not only that, but so electorally insignificant, at least in parliamentary elections, for decades, possibly since the late 1980s. Those of you who remember back to that time, the movement had already split once between the NF and the BNP. We won't go into the rights and wrongs of that. And then later, of course, the NF itself split because of the machinations of two people of whom you might have heard, one called Griffin, one called Harrington. History does repeat itself, doesn't it? And the result of that was that neither the NF nor the BNP contested any seats at that election. There might have been one or two unofficial candidates, but fought none officially. Whereas back in 1983, the NF and the BNP together, I think, fought something like 115 seats. In the recent general election, the grand total was down to, I think it was 16 at first count. It depends who you count and who you don't, I suppose. Frankly, from our point of view, we saw no point in trying to... We only had one candidate, Jim Luthwaite, whom you'll hear from later. We thought there was no point, frankly, in trying to field a larger number of candidates to combat the UKIP tsunami, because the UKIP tsunami was indeed just that. I was going to say that the results for all parties were undistinguished, but then I chose a different word. I think they were actually very distinguished by their awfulness. That isn't an indictment of any of the candidates, it's simply an indictment of the situation. The local government results were somewhat better. The Rump BNP certainly lost a council seat there, I think it's their last council seat, but got a respectable vote. But I think that was a tribute to the lady councillor, not to the party that she represented. I don't want to appear to be blowing our own trumpets, but 3 of our local government candidates, including Gary Topping there, got over 10%. I think you got 12, didn't you?
No, 10.2.
Yeah, 10.2. But there were 3 over 10%. So those were respectable votes, but not, of course, outstanding. And then we come to UKIP. The question is, where do we begin when we talk about UKIP? I think I'd like to say that it's not simply wrong in detail. It's not simply wrong at the edges. It's wrong at its very heart. From its foundation, way back, it put in non-sectarianism into its constitution, a constitution that can be changed only by a 2/3 majority. What does non-sectarian mean? Well, if it simply meant, well, they forbid their members to demonise or insult groups, whether ethnic or religious. Well, I wouldn't have much of an argument with that. I don't like insulting people for the sake of it, by any means. But of course it's interpreted to mean much, much more than that. We, genuine nationalists, know that nations and nationality are dependent on ancestry. They're not dependent, like citizenship, simply on accident of birthplace or a piece of paper. Citizenship, of course, can be acquired by legal contrivance, as say, by going through a ceremony or not going through a ceremony and having a piece of paper signed for you. Nationality is much deeper than that. Now, this might be a surprise to many English people. Try it out in the pub tonight, see whether other people would agree that in many cases in this country, people regard citizenship and nationality as synonymous. It comes up as a crossword cue every now and again. One is the clue, the other is the answer. People in Central and Eastern Europe know much better. In fact, even in the Soviet era, you won't often hear me praise the Soviet Union, but I'm afraid I'm going to a little bit now. Even in the Soviet era, a person's identity papers, their passport or internal identity papers, would mark them down as a Soviet citizen, if indeed they were, but would secondly mention their nationality, which might be Russian, it might be Ukrainian, it might be Georgian, it might even be Jewish. Yes, a nationality recognised in the Soviet Union. How were those nationalities acquired? They were acquired by heredity. So Khrushchev, even though, as far as I know, he was born in Russia, had Ukrainian parents. So if I were to see his identity papers, first of all, of course, I wouldn't be able to read the alphabet, but that's beside the point. It would probably have mentioned his nationality as Ukrainian because of his parentage. But as I say, today in the United Kingdom and much of Western Europe, the two are regarded as the same. But of course, UKIP is far worse than that. Farage, or Farage as I often referred to him in the European Parliament, I don't think we ought to give him airs and graces that he doesn't deserve. Farage has been quoted as saying, Britons are people who live in Britain and pay their taxes. No mention even of citizenship. And even as far as the resident's concerned, no mention of legality of reference. If you live in Britain and pay your taxes, you're British. Well. But then, when it comes to the man in the street, at the last election, I'm sure that you met many men in the street about the election. Well, they might say, at least they're opposed to immigration. At least they're opposed to further immigration. Well, of course, they're not. As I mentioned again, in the European Parliament, to the man himself. On the 4th of May 2010, Farage said on the Daily Politics show, Britain should issue 250,000 work permits every year. Now, those are just work permits and work permit holders. Those will bring in with them dependents. I'll take a conservative estimate and say 3 dependents. In fact, I think from the third world, many of them will have many more than those 3 dependents. But at the rate of an average of 3 dependents, that would make 1 million a year. That's the party that is described as being anti-immigration. Well, on the 11th of December 2013, as I say, I blue-carded him. That's a European Union expression. See, I've already gone native a little bit. And he was in the middle of a speech declaiming Eastern European immigration. But he was implying that his party was against immigration. So I said, well, how is it that you made that quotation in 2010, and yet you're implying that you're against immigration? His answer was quite astounding. He said, let me make this quite clear to you. And he looked in my direction when he said this. UKIP is not an anti-immigration party. We want immigration, we welcome immigration. You might have seen that on some of our leaflets, and you might have thought, oh, they've made this up or they've taken it out of context. No, we didn't. That's exactly what he said. Since then, I've been sending letters here, there and everywhere to newspapers trying to say, well, what's the contradiction? You describe UKIP as an anti-immigration party, and yet here's their leader saying this. As far as I know, none has ever been published. In fact, if we want... I'm very sceptical about conspiracies. You know, a lot of people would sort of say everything's a conspiracy. One person said to me on one occasion that if the media say anything, we know it's untrue. And I did say, what about the weather forecast? Well, that's particularly untrue, isn't it? And so on and so forth. But I don't go that far at all. I want proof of conspiracy. I want evidence. But I think this is a conspiracy for which there is evidence. That, you know, it's on public record. The European Parliament record is as good as anything. It's on public record that he's in favour of immigration. And yet the media were brazenly referring to UKIP as being an anti-immigration party. When I've tried to point it out, they've ignored that and just allowed their label to go ahead. But of course it was on the strength of that coverage, that media coverage, they got 3.8 million votes. You know, not far off 4 million votes. Indeed, if you add on the people who might have voted UKIP, but were frightened out of doing so by Cameron and the Conservatives at the last moment, well, you know, it could have been well in excess of 4 million. And those people, by and large, were persuaded not so much by the anti-EU rhetoric as by their anti-immigration rhetoric, and it was based on a falsehood. So we might ask, what's UKIP's game, and in particular, what's Farage's game? Well, again, he likes to let the cat out of the bag. I don't listen to any questions very much now, but I used to listen to it on Radio 4 every Friday evening. This sort of radio version of Question Time. Well, on Good Friday, I think it was May the 2nd, but it was certainly Good Friday 2010, this is 6 days before the general election of 2010, the panel members were each asked what was the political achievement of which they were most proud. Well, supposing I'd been or any of you have been a rank and file UKIPper, you know, think through your mind, what do you think Nigel Farage might have said that he was most proud of? Possibly, the year before, getting 13 MEPs elected. Of course, he was to get many more elected later on. You know, that was an achievement of which he might have been proud. Possibly making membership of the EU a major political issue. Yes, that's something of which he could make himself proud. His answer was quite astounding. He said, the achievement of which I'm most proud is preventing the British National Party from ever becoming a major political party. Now, if I were an ordinary rank-and-file UKIP member, what's he talking about? Even if I was a civic nationalist UKIP member, you know, what's he talking about? Why is he particularly proud of, you know, pushing another relatively minor party into the margins? Well, it really does give a clue as to what he's about. He's not there to get Britain out of the EU, still less to stop immigration. He's there to stop anybody else from doing that. Of course, actually, Farage was wrong, because whatever we might think of the BNP now, and the BNP under Griffin, then, in fact, that 6 days later, in the 2010 election, the BNP average vote was higher, not a lot higher, in fact just 8 votes higher than the average UKIP result. So his boast was wrong. He hadn't pushed the BNP into 4th or 5th place. And of course it wasn't really Nigel Farage who eventually destroyed the BNP. But as I've said in the past, what's the difference between Nigel Farage and Nick Griffin? Not very much. I once asked what the difference is between Nick Griffin and Nick Lowles. You might have heard of Nick Lowles. Well, the answer is, of course, that one of them has devoted his life to destroying the nationalist movement, and the other one is Nick Lowles. So, is it all doom and gloom? Are you all going to go away terribly upset and convinced that the nationalist movement has no future? Well, I don't think it is all doom and gloom by any means, because whatever we think of UKIP as an institution and its leadership, its members are not all bad. You know, only this week one of their Northwest members seems to have broken ranks and has, I think, joined, no, it hasn't joined your party, I think he's joined the BNP, hasn't it? Now, however badly advised he might be in doing that, it does suggest that he's somebody who's roughly on the right lines. And I think there are many others as well within UKIP, people who are ordinary members, or in some cases candidates who simply get their heads down. So we have a party that's badly led, intrinsically bad, but contains some good people. What's more, UKIP, whatever the motives of its leadership, did succeed in doing one thing. It loosened the bond between something like 4 million voters, and possibly more if you include the might have voted UKIP, and the main political parties. So, you know, 3.5 to 4 million people were previously voters for one of the main parties and shifted. There are a lot of genuine nationalists, former BNP voters and NF voters and so on, probably who went there as well. But most of them were people who'd previously voted for the main parties. And that bond has been broken or loosened. It's no longer as solid as it was. But it's important that if we hope, again, collectively, ever to attract them, we've got to make us and our policies as attractive as possible. I don't mean going down the UKIP line, of going down the civic line, of pretending that it's all about space, not race. That's a phrase I heard, I'm ashamed to say, at a BNP meeting way back in about 2008. I could name the person concerned, but I'm not going to, because I quite like the person personally, and they're no longer connected with that party anyway. So I don't mean going down that line. I think we must keep our principles absolute. You know, the main principle is nationality is determined by heredity, not by a piece of paper, not by accident of birth. That's a central principle. But what we can do is we can soften our policies in other ways. There's nothing wrong with saying immigration causes loss of greenfield sites, pressure on resources and so on, as well as affecting our identity. Nothing wrong with that at all. There's nothing wrong with showing concern for the third world by saying that bringing their people to prop up our health service is unfair to them as well as being unfair to us. It's taking their greatest talent, and I hope you won't think I'm being terribly unkind in saying this, they haven't got a surfeit of talent in the third world, taking their greatest talent and bringing them here. We know as hereditarians, if you take a population, you slice off the best, and then another few years you slice off the best, and then another few years and you slice off the best. After perhaps 3 or 4 slicings, the remnant population will be somewhat worse, somewhat less able. My view is the best foreign aid we could give to the third world, and I do have concern, I'm sure you do, is to stop looting the best of their people, and indeed to encourage the ethnic minorities in our midst to get rid of the bit of plaster that's put in over them with the words British on it, and to go back to their own identities and to reinvest themselves in their countries and their continents of origin. That's the way we can treat them with the greatest of respect, not pretending that they're sort of second-class British citizens. Right, I really will sum up now. So are we on a course to win? I'm afraid the answer is we can't tell, because even if we redouble our own efforts, whether we win or not depends on factors that are outside of our control, factors within UKIP, within the media, within the wider population. But I think what we can do, we could easily guarantee failure by doing the wrong things. We've got to avoid that. And we must do things that would facilitate success. It's always sometimes a temptation for nationalists to say brave things. Makes you feel a lot better, doesn't it? Especially if you're in a closed meeting. You know, if I say something really brave and really offensive at the same time. Shall I give you an example? No, better not. I don't really want to be dragged before the beak. It might make me feel good. But the thing I would say is that we're not in politics to feel good. We're in politics to succeed and to facilitate success. Thank you.